This morning, we were led to a wonderful start by Dr. Jack Levison, and I only wish he had more energy, don't you? You heard me introduce him. Today, this afternoon, we will also be hearing from Dr. Priscilla Pope Levison, and they are quite a duo. She is a match for him in every way. She is a pastor, a historian, a higher education administrator, a professor, and an award-winning author. Her heart for evangelism shines through everything that she does. Each of you received, as a church, 2 books today, and if you haven't yet picked those up, you can today and tomorrow. One of those was written by Priscilla, the other one by Jack. Priscilla's is Models of Evangelism, and that's a top 5 book on the Jesus Creed blog and Resource of the Year in Theology and Biblical Studies by Outreach Magazine. We encourage you to use these in your local church as you continue to perpetuate the theme of this annual conference of offering Christ every day. I told you that when Lee and I met the Levisons on the EO excursion, that we so enjoyed visiting with them and hearing of some of their adventures. We did a lot of story swapping. And you will find that not only is Jack very animated and a great storyteller, so is Priscilla. She is going to now lead us, along with Jack, in talking about the very important question, testimony, why? Please express your warm welcome to the Levisons. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we are delighted and honored to be here, even though, as you know, we still haven't been able to change our clothes yet. But good news, the suitcase is at the baggage service at Huntsville Airport, so we're making progress. What I'm sad about, though, is that Jack, who isn't that he's not a fashionista, right? But our son, our 27-year-old son, got married in November, and I did my PhD in Scotland, and we lived there for a year back in the late 80s. And we were going back to celebrate our 40th wedding anniversary. Actually, after an EO trip we led on Celtic Christianity in Scotland, and we stayed on for an extra week, and Jack got it in his mind, and you could see from this morning, when Jack gets something in his mind, he just repeats it and repeats it and repeats it, right?
So we were, am I on here? Am I mic'd? Am I mic'd?
Oh, you're going to interrupt me already?
I'll interrupt you. So, we were talking in the elevator. I said, I probably was a little repetitive today, and she said, I wanted to sit in the back and go like this. Cut it off. Cut it off. Cut it off.
So anyway, we were in Edinburgh, and he had it in mind that he wanted to get a tweedy suit.
I had a little speckled, I had a brown speckled vest.
We are never going to get
And I wanted the suit to mimic that brown speckled vest. So don't think Harris tweed, it's different.
Okay, so long story short, we bought one. It's gorgeous, green, and he was going to wear it to preach today. So I don't know. You'll have to let him know whether he can wear that tomorrow. It'll be a little dressed up for tomorrow. So I want to thank the bishop for this wonderful invitation. When she emailed me, we said yes right away. I do want to do a shout out to some of the good leadership here in North Alabama. Mm-hmm. We have been so helped by Lisa Key Matthews, by Sarah planning the worship, by Danette in communications, and a very, very special thank you to John. I don't know where you are, John.
I think he's in the back.
Even last night, we were texting at 11:30 in the airport saying, okay, we're here. But I'm just very grateful for that. And I also want to thank Lee, who is showing us around and helping us find rooms and everything. So, as you'll see, Jack and I are very different, but over 40 years, we have blended many things together, including academic fields. He's in biblical studies. I've taught theology, church history, women's studies, Wesleyan studies, but my heart is where God called me, and that is as a pastor. I'm a clergy member of the West Ohio Conference, and I believe that my pastoral heart, I hope, exudes everything that I do. And that includes in evangelism and testimony, which has been on my heart, trying to help people become comfortable talking about God and pointing the way, as John the Baptist did, and the Samaritan woman, we'll be talking about them tomorrow, testifying to Jesus. So we are approaching the conference theme of Offer Christ Every Day through the lens of testimony. And if we could start the PowerPoint, that would be great. So testimony, I know when I say that word, it's like evangelism and other words in our Christian vocabulary, and I wish I could talk to each of you to understand how you react to that word. But I'm going to tell you in a minute why that is the focus of my work right now in ministry. But we're going to approach, as I said, your theme through the lens of testimony, because Jack and I believe, and it's now being confirmed in the churches that I work with, that testimony, we believe, is that going to work?
We're only getting your display over there.
Okay. We believe that testimony, sharing our God stories, awakens faith. And that's really what we're going to be talking about for the next sessions together, is testimony in the churches, testimony as individuals. And I'm going to start out with a little unexpected for a United Methodist group, but I'm going to start off with my favorite quote about testimony was spoken by Dorothy Day, who was converted to Catholicism as an adult. And she was a pacifist. Some people found her to be an anarchist. She was a radical for Jesus and founded the Catholic Workers' Movement. And I love her quote because to me it encapsulates a lot of feelings about testimony. And she says, if I've achieved anything in my life, it's because I have not been embarrassed to talk about God. And I know I, and probably many of you, are sometimes and maybe oftentimes embarrassed to talk about God. And so I keep that kind of as a mantra, because if my life could be like Dorothy Day's, wow. So what I'm doing right now at Perkins, when Jack got the call to come to Perkins, we were happily ensconced at Seattle Pacific University. I was professor of theology and working with the women's studies program. We'd raised our kids in Seattle, Pacific Northwest, mountains, water, it doesn't get any better. And
Rain.
Yes, it does rain a little bit.
Rain.
But when we moved to Dallas, I actually went into administration. That was an interesting career for 7 years. I was associate dean. And then I started writing grants for the Lilly Foundation, for the Lilly Endowment. And the last $1 million grant that we received is in Testimony HQ, a shorthand for testimony as community engagement. And as I said, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But I want to tell you about two churches that we are working with. Actually, I'm going to introduce the churches, And then I'm going to ask you to do some reflection about your own church. One of the churches we're going to hear about in a minute is University Christian Church in Austin, Texas. It's a Disciples of Christ church. And the other one is Williams Memorial CME Temple in Shreveport, Louisiana. CME is the Christian Methodist Episcopal denomination. So it is a sister denomination to the United Methodist Church. Now, both University Christian and Williams Memorial CME are what the authors of the book Breaking the Huddle, which I highly recommend, both of these churches are what they would call a huddled community. Now, let me just say right off the bat, I'm going to introduce you to 3 different communities, types of communities, and I'm going to ask you to be evaluating where you think your church is. And there's no right or wrong, there's no judgment here, because I think it's important as we're talking about offering Christ every day that we understand where we are now. One of my favorite authors you're going to meet, I have a quote from him tomorrow, Kevin Harney, wrote a book called Organic Outreach, talks about how each of us has an evangelistic temperature. It's in my book in the first chapter, Personal Evangelism, from like 0 to 10. And figuring out where you are on that scale is important, because no matter where you are, you can heat that up, right? You can develop a warmer temperature. So, huddled community. Huddled communities, if most of you probably are old enough to remember Cheers, right? So when I think of a huddled community, the song, sometimes, come on, you can sing it with me. Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name. Bum, 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 bum. And they're always glad you came, right? So,
Norm.
coming into...
Sorry.
He shouted Norm in case you didn't hear it.
What did you say?
Coming into a
What did she
huddled
say?
community is a safe place. It's a good thing. Huddled communities are a place where people feel at home. Now, what results in that, though, is that they can be insulated from the communities around them. And having deep relationships with people outside the church is not a high value with a huddled community, because if you're always, in a sense, turning to the outside, then it may not feel safe for those who are coming in. Now, there's not a particular kind of church in terms of size or worship style or theology or location. Huddled communities, believe me, are all over the place. And as I said, they prioritize relationships within the community, but that doesn't mean that they're not doing a lot of outreach. Huddled communities can be turned outside, but often in a transactional way and not as interested in building connections with outsiders. And then in terms of faith sharing or testimony, if they think of it at all, it would be kind of as a special endeavor, better left to professionals who have that gift, maybe the pastor, because the pastors are supposed to be able to do everything, right? Or it's something for a special season, like a revival season or something like that. Now, these authors talk about 2 other kinds of community. The huddled community, the witnessing community, and conversion community. Witnessing communities, and again, I hope you're thinking about your own community and where you might fit. So being a witness for Christ is a normal part of this community, and it's reflected in the way they spend their money, in the activities that they do, in discipleship opportunities, and in this kind of community, conversions, professions of faith happen on a regular basis. These can also vary in size, and what you'll have sometimes is a vibrant pocket like a youth group or a Sunday school class that is a witnessing community, perhaps within a larger huddled community. So again, there are lots of options on how these will look. What's really true about witnessing communities is that they expect God to be at work in their midst, and they're on the lookout for that to happen. To use Jack's phrases from this morning, they're outside standing on the mountain, right? They're waiting, looking, anticipating that God will pass by. It's normal to have visitors, unchurched, at their services, at their events. This, I think, is a critical key, maybe because I've taught evangelism for so long, but there's regular training, regular conversation, regular opportunities for training in testimony in evangelism. Okay, then the last one, and I have to admit, I'm not sure I've ever seen a conversion community. The picture that comes to mind is the early Church of Pentecost in Acts 2. Or maybe seasons of revival or great awakenings. These kinds of community God moments become God movements. They lean into receptive peoples. Receptive peoples is a church growth term that talks about God's kind of bringing some people to receptivity in every season. It's oftentimes people who are going through a life change. And these church communities lean into receptive peoples. Professions of faith are the norm. And to use a Celtic term, there's a thin place between church and community. So when you think about which kind of community is your church, I don't know, I know we're a big group, and I'm not sure I want to put people on the spot, but do you have a kind of a sense of where your church is at this point? Yes? Okay, so maybe not raise hands, but okay, so I'll say that Jack and I are worshiping in a huddled community right now, very much so. I want so much to do something in evangelism, but evangelism is not a good word for this community. And they are out in mission, but it's mission and outreach, and evangelism is not a part of the equation. And actually, most of the churches that we've been involved in throughout the years are huddled communities. Maybe that's not true in North Alabama. But I say all this to introduce you to these two churches. Now, the grant that I'm running, we take up to 10 churches a year within a 350-mile radius of Dallas. And we ask them to spend an entire year with a focus on testimony as community engagement. The first 6 months, they're really developing proficiency in telling God stories within their community as the church. And then we ask them in the second 6 months to spill those out into the community at large. Now, again, I'm going to go back to what I said before about testimony. It's not always a favorite word. And this first church, University Christian, was really hesitant, University of Texas at Austin, right? So it's a gorgeous, gorgeous church that is so well endowed financially that it can exist paying its bills whether it has a membership or not. I know, wouldn't you like to have a little bit of that?
It's like most modern seminaries are going to become soon enough, right? If we don't send us students.
So the building itself is renowned. It's like a cathedral. Think about a European cathedral for its artistic features. It's made, I looked this up because its walls are made of Texas Cordova shell limestone that was formed 150 million years ago, and it was gotten from a quarry about an hour and a half out of Austin. You see these beautiful carvings around as you come in. These depict at the top the apostles' shield, and then you've got the Kairos sign, and then Jesus, the Alpha and the Omega. I'm building to this, okay? Are you getting this? Then this great window over the sanctuary, which is 16 feet by 21 feet, depicts Jesus as the great teacher, keeping with the university, and the Texas chair in Bible is endowed by this church. And yet, in the midst of this historic building, University Christian was huddled, and I would suggest still is technically a huddled community, but at this point, sitting across the street from 50,000 plus students, we asked churches to put together an intergenerational leadership team of 79 people with at least 2 young people, like a youth and a young adult. They couldn't come up with 1 university student to put on the leadership team. That's a huddled community. And yet, so they're, like Jack talked about today, they're Elijah in the cave. And yet, they took some steps out. So, I want to tell you what the leader said to us as she was looking back on the year. She said, "It didn't catch on overnight. We wandered in what we felt like the wilderness for the first few months. We were discouraged at how long it took us to develop our project. Life happened to everyone on the team. Major events included a sudden cancer diagnosis and 2 surgeries, transplant surgery, the death of an adult child, COVID, job disappointment, graduation from high school and college. We could have stopped at any given point with these setbacks. But we had encouragement from Perkins, the shared stories of our cohort churches, homemade cookies for the leadership team, and the Holy Spirit." And they persevered. And I want to tell you about what these 2 churches did, hopefully to give you some ideas of what's possible. It's nothing earth-shattering in a way. But this is what they did internally as they were developing testimony in the congregation in those first 6 months. They devoted their Lenten study to testimony, and many testimonies were given over that time period. They had an elders retreat on testimony, and during that time, each of the elders, that's part of the polity of the disciples of Christ, gave their testimony. They gave testimonies in worship. Some were live, some were pre-recorded, and finally they hosted a big storytelling workshop event in the summer for the congregation where people just began to try on this idea. Now, externally, they painted a door. Now, I told you that the building was made out of this limestone, right? And you see up there that it's tan. And everything's tan. Every single door. And they realized, that people didn't know where to come in. So they painted it red. Sometimes it's just not rocket science.
And we're in
And,
Huntsville where there's a lot of rocket science, but you don't need it.
sorry, how are we doing on time? And they put up a huge banner. You are so loved. Now, as Doc told you, we live with college students. And at a place like UT Austin, where it's very hard to get in, or SMU, students have a lot going on, right? They look very together on the outside, but they're really not on the inside, talking about the inner self. And that banner proclaiming, you are so loved. So a red door and a banner. And then thinking about their context. This wouldn't work for the next church I'm going to talk about. But this works for their context because this is their community. They started, again, you heard me say they couldn't name one university student to put on their leadership team. So they started hosting snack extravaganza during finals week. Great idea, right? During finals week, and as students are moving in, and then they had dinners on Wednesday night in the courtyard facing UT, and students began to come. Again, it's not that hard, but until you say, I want to have these conversations with this community, and they put themselves in the place. Now, what I find most exciting is that this Easter, remember, Disciples of Christ do adult believer baptism. They hadn't had baptisms for as long as anyone could remember. They had 6 baptisms this Easter. They have university students coming to services. They have younger people joining, and they are often people, they're people of color who are coming into this white congregation. And Crystal, the woman who runs this work, said, testimony is one of the pillars that moved us from inertia we felt from the pandemic and provided hope in ways we can't imagine. Now, I am not presenting this as secret sauce, but I'm hoping that will inspire you in some way when we're done, that these are possible through testimony. I'm going to tell you about one other church. I need to hurry, don't I?
No,
All
they'll
right.
fit it. We'll fit.
Okay, so very, very different kind of church, not just racially, but Shreveport, Louisiana is a different place from Austin, Texas. And the CME tradition is a black tradition with all of the riches and resources of that tradition. So this church is 120 years old. The cornerstone was laid in 1903. After the first church burned down, a second one was built, and then it was found to be full of asbestos. So 6 years ago, they had to abandon that building, and when Jack and I went to speak there, it was literally, they were meeting in an event center on an interchange of I-20. And they were in the middle of nowhere. And then COVID hit. And they too were a huddled community, partly because of COVID, partly because of their location, and partly because they're an older congregation. But the pastor signed up, they applied for this, and she wrote, testimony has always been a part of our heritage. Since the inception of the CME, the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, in 1870, we've carried on the practice of testimony from the traditions of our African roots through slavery, Jim Crow policies, civil rights struggles, and the ongoing plight of the African American in the United States. Our stories of perseverance and faith have been passed down through the centuries, providing solace and encouragement during good and uncertain times. And I have to say, this church is the most amazing church that I've ever worked with, because when you ask someone from Williams Memorial to show up, the village shows up, the family, it's amazing. So what did they start? And now they just moved in this spring. They bought a church from the Episcopal congregation who could no longer sustain it. They're on a 6-acre wooded property, and I'll talk to you about in a minute what they're doing with it. So what did they do in the congregation? They had monthly gatherings to study and practice testimony. They set up Testimony Tuesday social media posts, so when someone gave a testimony in the congregation, they would post it on social media. They became very adept at social media, mostly thanks to Sandra Robertson, who you see there on the PowerPoint. They really have taken social media to heart and are working with that. They had a testimony month in November and called it See What the Lord Has Done. And so all the activities for that month were focused on testimony. And then they, like University Christian, planned spontaneous and then planned testimony events in the congregation. Externally, so I said they're now in a 6-acre property. They've constructed, phase 1, phase 2 will be worked on this summer. They prayed and they dreamed, and with some of the resources from our work and their congregation, they believed that God was asking them to build a healing garden, particularly for those who died during COVID, but for anyone who'd lost loved ones, as a place to come around, be surrounded by nature and beauty, and to grieve. And this is what it looks like right now. It's very simple and very lovely. So the first event they hosted in the garden last fall was actually carried on the local news, which then went across the nation, was in partnership with an organization called Moms on a Mission. And the first chapter was founded in Shreveport a year ago. And Moms on a Mission is an organization that brings together moms who have lost a child to gun violence. And they gathered last fall in the Healing Garden, and this is what Sandra, you saw her picture, wrote. The testimonies flowed spontaneously through word and song. The event was so powerful that not only did the mothers share testimonies as well as members of the church, but also a vocalist composed and performed a testimony in song. Even the local news cameraman who was covering the event put down the camera and shared his testimony. After the service around the bell tower, participants called out names of lost loved ones, and the bells sounded for each one, and prayers traveled to the one who hears and answers all prayers. The event ended with prayer, and for a moment we were frozen in a healing place. No one moved. No one spoke. We let the Holy Spirit have sway. So about 2 weeks ago, Jack and I had the honor of being in Shreveport for the first anniversary of Moms on a Mission. And
I'll keep it very short. Priscilla gave me permission to talk, so this is not an interruption. We went out and visited, and it was in this large fellowship hall, and we walked in, and there were 3 white people. It was entirely a black community. There were tables like this up front with 25 women, all of whom had lost their mostly sons to gun violence. And they were being celebrated and honored and feted. It was like this incredible disequilibrium for people like us to be in that community where there was so much despair and so much hope simultaneously. And that came out of this small step of a healing garden, and then connecting that to this movement, Moms on a Mission. And it was really, we processed that the whole way back to Dallas, of what it meant and felt like to be in that community of hope, faith, despair, loss, encouragement. And that came out of all of this work in testimony of offering Christ daily in practical ways.
Thank you.
Well, I hope that was okay.
So, very quickly, because Jack has
I'm okay.
he's going to close us out. So why am I doing this? I'm doing this because during COVID, when everything shut down, what I saw happening in many churches in online worship service, including the church where we worship, was the integration of testimony, because we all wanted to hear from each other, right? We were locked down, horrible things were happening to loved ones near and far and around the world, and we were desperate to know how God was at work. Was God at work? And one of the testimonies that struck both Jack and myself so much was this young woman, younger than either of our kids, who was on the front line in Parkland Hospital in Dallas, the front line before really anything was known and people were dying alone. And in her faith, she said, "At work, I'm more than just a nurse. I'm the hands and feet of God. I'm trying to be family to them. Faith is giving me strength to do that." And here's one other testimony that I'd like you to listen to.
Despite hearing about millions of people losing their jobs in the last few months, I never anticipated I would be among them. I've asked myself all of those normal questions in the midst of this kind of grief, like why God could let something like this happen or what I did to deserve it, before ultimately realizing I'm not going to find peace or comfort with any of those questions. In my moments of deepest despair, when depression and anxiety and panic are creeping in, God has shown up for me in the kind words and sweet gestures and listening ear of numerous friends and family members. When I forget that I'm created in the image of God and worthy of love, they've been there to challenge that voice of doubt and to remind me of God's greater purpose for me, even if I don't know what that looks like right now. Though unexpected and life-changing, this has also been faith-affirming as I've witnessed God's love and compassion just through the people around me in new ways each day.
So these are just two examples of the testimonies that we started hearing at this time. And Jack said to me, "Priscilla, do you really think Lily's going to give you $1 million to help people talk about God?" And I said, "Yes." And they did. And I've had a lot of meaningful ministry in my career, vocation that's about to close down soon. And I am as energized as ever because I'm seeing the difference that testimony makes for churches. And I am going to skip through this because
Don't.
Really, it's just, here you go.
Before she does
No,
that,
because it's almost 10 till.
what time we have to be done, Bishop?
Yeah.
3. So
You got
it's
10
almost 10
minutes.
till. She just takes the time, sucks the air out of the room. So,
There you go.
okay, but I want to say before I hit my little 3 points, if you look at Priscilla's book, those who have a copy of the book, I read it thoroughly. I edited it thoroughly. I love to write, and so I edited it thoroughly. And it really is, if you want to get out of the cave, it's small steps. You know, it's not all at once. So like one of the chapters I love the most, but surprisingly, you'll die, is the visitation chapter. It's where people go 2 by 2 to doors and knock on doors like Jehovah's Witnesses, right? Well, it's an amazing chapter because it doesn't say people knocked on doors to tell people what they needed and where they were wrong, right? That wasn't what was happening. in that visitation, they were saying, what can we as a church do for you? Because they realized the church didn't know their community. And the only way to get to know the community is to knock on doors and greet the people and say, what can we as a church offer you as a community? Priscilla's right. It's not rocket science. It doesn't take a lot. Now, she has a whole program for how you do that in that chapter. But the example that I'll remember is that in Philadelphia, there was a church. I'm going to get to it. In Philadelphia, there was a church where they went out and they did this. It was an inner city church, and they went out and they did this. And you know what they learned? What people needed were hospital beds for their living rooms and stuff, for people who were sick and dying. And you know what the church did? They supplied hospital beds to their community because 2 by 2 they knocked on doors. Now, why I'm saying that is, all of us are probably internally saying, oh no, so I'm not gonna go knocking on anybody's doors. I'm not gonna do that, but then you're not gonna know the neighborhood. And so there's this amazing stuff in her book that's like, it's like, oh yeah, it's sort of the pin drops. Oh yeah, that's not hard. It's a matter of will to do that. So what today is the why of testimony. Why should you bother doing this? I'm going to end up with notes here, 3 considerations of why we should be doing testimony.
The picture.
What?
The picture.
Well, do I have to do that today? Okay. So I want you to notice, first of all, in these pictures, all of the pictures we're using as a backdrop are from 7 Secrets of the Spirit-Filled Life, that wonderful little book you get for free. These were pictures taken. Our son's a professional videographer, photographer, and so he and I took some really cool road trips. And we were up at dawn and stayed till dark down on the Texas coast, out in California and things, getting photos for this book. So all the backgrounds for the next 3 sessions, including this one, this is the beginning of the book, and we want this to symbolize to you, this is the pathway to testimony. Okay? Just starting out. You're not going to be experts. So the first consideration is testimony is not about judgment. It's not about my telling you what you need to have. Let's get rid of that idea that I'm going to stand on the stage sweating with a big Bible telling you what you need to know, or that, we've all been judged. We've all had that happen. But that's not testimony. Testimony is one beggar telling another beggar where to find food. This is a quotation from D.T. Niles of Sri Lanka, and this is the larger context of that. He said, evangelism is witness. It is one beggar telling another beggar where to get food. The Christian does not offer out of his bounty. He has no bounty. He is simply a guest at his master's table, and as evangelist, he calls others too. The evangelistic relation is to be alongside of, not over against. The Christian stands alongside the non-Christian and points to the gospel, the holy action of God. So a good definition for what we're talking about when we talk about sharing, offering Christ every day is this. Having one beggar tell another beggar where to find food. That's what we do. Okay, that's one consideration in the why we do this. The next one is this. Testimony can be costly, right? So testimony, when we say, I'm happy helping people, but I don't really feel comfortable talking about Jesus. I'm happy distributing something, but don't make me talk about why I'm doing this as a Christian. And so, we're a little bit generally, I think, frightened, worried, apprehensive about what people may think. How will people react? That's a great question. How will people react? People can have pretty vicious and vitriolic responses to the good news. That's because the good news is consequential. It's important. It's potentially life-changing. It may even show up the disparity between where we are and sometimes where we need to be. And so people will respond sometimes defensively or angrily. And that's a consideration we need to know when we participate in telling God's story. That some people won't want to hear it and they will respond angrily. So it's no surprise that the Greek word for testimony, martyrion, is related to the English word martyr. That in fact, it may be costly for you, even if you tell it in a winsome and loving and caring way. It may be costly to tell God's story because it may illuminate the darkness of our story. And people may not want to see the darkness and they may respond angrily. So that's the second consideration, even as we try to make all of this winsome, and Priscilla is nothing if not winsome in her approach to evangelism, it can be costly. One beggar telling another beggar where to find food can be costly, but thirdly, ultimately, testimony is good news, right? Evangelion in Greek. EU, as in euthanasia, a good death. I'm sorry about the death images, but there's a lot of good EU words. Euthanasia, a good death. A eulogy, a good word. I'm euphoric. I'm carried well in Greek. A euphemism. Oh, that sermon was interesting. The second thing is the word angel, euangelion, a messenger. Essentially, we need to remember when we think about the good news, about offering Christ every day, is that we're beggars telling people where to find bread, that there may be a negative reaction, but that ultimately this is about good news, about God's story. And that's why in Romans 10:13 to 15, Paul writes this, "For," then he quotes from Joel, "everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." And then he begins to ask a bunch of questions, because it's not easy to get people to call upon the name of the Lord. But how are they to call on one in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in one of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone to proclaim him? And how are they to proclaim him unless they are sent? As it is written, now he quotes from another Bible verse, Isaiah 52:7, "How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news." I want to focus on two things very briefly about this. Oh, I don't want you to see that yet. The first thing is the word saved. It's very easy to think of the word saved like on the billboards. I don't know if you have them in Alabama. We have the billboards in Texas, the ABC, how to get saved, you know. You're driving along. Okay, now I know. And that's not what salvation is. We all in this room know that salvation is something far more holistic than that. My mother used to have Raleigh's salve, right? And salvation is really salvation. It's a way of finding healing for the whole of ourselves. So I like to think that when Paul is writing in Romans 10, he's writing about being salved, salvation. But then at the end, the really beautiful part is that he quotes from Isaiah 52:7, which is part of Isaiah 40 to 55 that is bringing hope to people in exile. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. This word beautiful, I just looked it up 3 days ago. I just looked it up in the Hebrew 3 days ago. It occurs 2 other places in the Old Testament. And the first place it occurs is in Psalm 93:5. "Your decrees are very sure. Holiness is perfectly suitable to your house," or perfectly suits your house, O Lord, forevermore. So that word beautiful, used of the feet of those of us who bring good news to our world, means our feet are perfectly suited to this work, to going out and telling people about God's story. Then the next place it is used is just beautiful. It's used in the Song of Songs. Your cheeks are beautiful with ornaments, your neck with strings of jewels. And that word, beautiful, of the feet of those of us who bring good news, is used by a lover of his lover, and how beautiful she is, a lover's view of his beloved. So, if you take up the charge, if you really do this, if we become people adept at telling others the good news of God like one beggar to another, if we do that, your feet, now look at your feet, those ugly, stubbly things on the bottom of your legs.
Flat
I'm a
feet.
size 12 and a half, and I haven't got an arch. I walk through the locker room, it's big feet. But you know what? When I'm telling people the good news of the story of God, these old clompers are beautiful. And so are yours. So there's this sense that our feet are beautiful when we're in the business of bringing good news of God's story to the world. And then also you'll be able to say, I'm made for this. This suits me. Telling people good news of God's story suits me, like in Psalm 93. Not at first maybe, but with practice, you'll say, this suits me. So, no matter how people respond, bearing testimony about the good news of Jesus ultimately makes everyone in this room a beautiful messenger, perfectly suited to the work you've been given. And over the next couple of days, bear that in mind.
So that's what we have for you this afternoon. Love to have you back at 9 tomorrow morning. We're going to be 9.
9? I was up
9.
at 7 this morning.
9. Tomorrow morning, I'll be teaching on testimony how? ? So we hope you'll see. Hope to see you here in the tomorrow morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, Priscilla and Jack both. We love your content and also your banter.